Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Metal Command podcast. Tony here with you, and today I'm here to talk about OverKill. They have a new song out entitled The Surgeon, which is off of their upcoming album called Scorched, and I'm here to talk about why I feel they are one of the most underrated thrash metal bands of all time and why they are one of the most consistent. And folks, I got to tell you, OverKill is a band that has a lot of significance for me and a lot of significance to the Metal Command show. Number one, back in the day when everybody was listening to Nirvana, Soundgarden, and, Pearl Jam and all this grunge stuff in the early 90s, here's me as this 14, 15, 16-year-old kid listening to WFO, listening to Horoscope, The Years of Decay, and OverKill was one of my favorite bands in high school, back during the time when heavy metal just was uncool, right? And I look back at that and I realized they were one of the few bands that actually didn't give up and pretty much stayed consistent, putting out album after album during the darkest time that the heavy metal genre has ever seen. And I've always had a lot of respect for them for that. Now, the new song just pretty much solidifies what I've been saying and backs up what I've been saying all along about OverKill. I think when Ironbound came out, they reached a whole new level of awesomeness with not only the production and quality of the albums, but the songwriting in general. Because, I look at OverKill in three different eras. I consider the early era, the first album, Feel the Fire, all the way through, let's say WFO. And then once you got to like the mid 90s with the Killing Kind, we had a lot of those albums all the way up until Ironbound came out. Those albums were pretty good. From the Underground and Below was actually a very good album, and I have some great memories about that I'll talk about here in a second. Then you had a couple records that, they were okay. Like Bloodletting was probably my least favorite OverKill album that has ever come out. But for the most part, the albums were still pretty solid and pretty good. But then they hit what I consider the new era of the band, Ironbound. And for the past 13 years, OverKill has put out these albums that, number one, in my opinion, from 2010 on, this is the best material this band has ever done. And that's saying a lot because Horoscope is an excellent album. WFO, to me, was actually that was probably one of my favorite albums in high school. I used to listen to that and The Sound of White Noise by Anthrax. Those were like two of the albums I listened to nonstop as a kid, as 16, 17-year-old back then. But this newest era, to me, just shows you how consistently good this band is and how a lot of these thrash bands have really put out better material than what they were putting out, in the past. For example, I think Exodus, Death Angel, and Testament are bands that are putting out albums consistently better than what they were doing early on in their careers. Now, a lot of people may disagree with me on that, because people have this nostalgic thing going on where they say, you can never do better than the original or the earlier albums. I don't look at music like that. I don't say, okay, it'll never be better than this album from 1988, but I'll be honest with you, I think OverKill is putting out their best material right now, and they've aged like a fine wine. And a lot of bands have done that. When I look at Motorhead, I love the newer stuff better than the old stuff. I thought Motorhead was putting out better albums as they got older. Saxon is like that. They're putting out their best material, and these guys are like in their 70s, 60s and 70s. They were just cranking out these albums. So I think with OverKill, it's the same kind of thing. I think they are really putting out these consistently good records, and they're always that band that, along with probably Exodus, these two bands always sort of get left out of that conversation because I know we have this Big Four thing. I know that's been a big trend and, a big thing in heavy metal for a very, very long time with, Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax, and, Metallica. But I always thought to myself for years that a band like Testament, a band like OverKill, and Exodus, these are three excellent thrash metal bands that have never, that really are on the level musically with those other bands. I know there's the Big Four guys. I know it's been a big slogan and a big marketing thing, but the reality is a band like OverKill musically is on their level. And from the live show perspective, I had a list. I don't remember what it was, but my top live bands ever. I remember I took this poll and live metal bands. This was years ago. This was probably about 8 or 9 years ago. I took this poll. I took it on my radio show actually, and the top 2 bands listed as far as a live show goes were Exodus and Overkill. I can't remember who was number 1, but having seen both of those bands live and how intense they are, I can tell you that it did not surprise me that those were, and it actually in the poll, they beat out Iron Maiden with the listeners. There were quite a few people that took this poll, but I would agree with that. Exodus is a phenomenal live act, and so is Overkill. And to be honest with you, I think they're pretty close as far as the intensity of their performances and watching these bands live. And again, I've always said that my favorite 2 thrash metal vocalists were Steve Zetro Souza and Bobby Blitz Ellsworth from Overkill. They're just, those guys live, they just bring out this, like, I don't know, they just take it to another level. That's just what it is. So I'm really excited for this album called Scorched. Oh, man, I just get excited when an Overkill album comes out, and I have a lot of great memories. Now, a couple fun facts about this band. Blitz has come on the show, on the radio show before in the past a few times, over the years. And when I first started this radio show, when I first started my actual radio show, From the Underground and Below had just come out. And then they had Necroshine come out shortly after that. And Overkill was coming around the Cleveland area and Akron area quite a bit and playing shows. And I would always interview Blitz, and I would always hang out with him at the show early on during the time when I started this show. And there is this whole saying, they always say you never want to meet your heroes, right? Because you'll be disappointed. And early on in this show, I'll be honest with you, I got really lucky because the bands that I met when I did this show, the first band I met was Sabotage. I met Halloween. Obviously, some of you know my relationship with them. But then, I met Overkill too, and a lot of these other bands. And I can tell you that the experiences were always positive. Blitz was a great person to have on the air. He was a really great interview. He was enthusiastic. He was just really, really cool to be able to talk to, and was really great to a lot of the fans. And it really made the experience, being a young kid at the time doing this show, really helped motivate me to keep doing this show. Now it's been 25 years. I'm still doing it. And people like him and some of the other musicians I met early on were a great inspiration in wanting me to continue this, just based on my interactions with them, and not only interviewing them, but meeting them and interacting with them in person. So I have a lot of love for Overkill, and I have a lot of respect for them and what they do. And man, I can tell you that this next album, my gut feeling is, they really haven't missed on anything. The song is great. Again, The Surgeon, really, really cool song. And another fun fact. So for those of you that may or may not know this, I wrote, and for those of you that may or may not know this, I did photography and I wrote articles for a Pontiac magazine. And when I bought my Firebird, so some of you may or may not know this, I have a 2000 Firebird Formula. I bought it brand new. And the album Bloodletting came out not long after I bought the car. And it was funny, when I first bought it, like the first ever passenger I had in the car was Bobby Blitz. And what was crazy about it is I remember I picked him up in it because I actually picked him up to take him to the radio station. So we did an interview, in a production room. We did an interview in person. And I roll up in this thing. They were playing at the Agora at the time. And he looks at me, he goes, "Man, they're paying you a lot of money to do this." I'm like, "Well, I don't know about that, but I did get this car." So it was a fun experience. We talked a lot in the car, but he was, when I go to these car shows, and there's a lot of older people that really aren't into heavy metal music. And there was this thing that came up. Who was the first passenger in your hot rod or your car? And I say Bobby Blitz Ellsworth from a band called Overkill. And they'll give me this horrified look like, "What? Who?" But it's kind of funny when I tell people the story that really aren't into metal. They kind of look at me when I say it's a band called, when I say, yeah, he sings in a band called Overkill. And they all give me this like horrified look, like like a deer in headlights, like what, like this is crazy. Who would listen to a band with that name? But it happens. And it's a pretty fun thing to be able to tell people. And I can be honest with you, to this day, in the back of the car, there's an actual 12-disc CD changer. For those of you that remember those, they were hip and cool back in the 2000s, late 90s, et cetera, et cetera. Ever since I've had the car, there's always been one OverKill album in that changer that I would listen to when I drive it, even to this day. In fact, the CD that is actually in there right now is The Killing Kind. Actually, that was the CD that I had in there. I actually listened to that album right before I put the car up for the wintertime. So definitely a lot of love for OverKill. Folks, check out the new song, The Surgeon. I highly recommend it. They're going to put out another great thrash metal album coming up here called Scorched, and I cannot wait for it. So with that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal. See you next time.